For this mini lesson, we are going to look at what are known as relative frequency tables. So earlier in a mini lesson, we looked at what's called a two-way table, and we see an example here where we looked at Miss Johnson's class and students that had chores as well as students that had curfews. And so what we're going to do today is look at what a relative frequency table is in comparison. So this is an example of a frequency. So we know, for instance, that there are 12 students that have curfews and that have chores. We also know our frequency. There are 30 students in the entire class. Or we could say that there are 13 students without a curfew. So those values are representative of a frequency. Now, a relative frequency does a comparison to the total. So we are actually going to calculate some relative frequencies looking at this specific example. So a relative frequency can be calculated by the entire total, or it can go across by row or across by column. And it really depends on what we're trying to find and discover from the two-way table, which relative frequency we will use. So this example, we're going to go by row. So think about what that means. When we're looking across by row, a relative frequency is how much out of the total. So for instance, when we're thinking about our total students, we have 17 that have a curfew and we have 13 that do not. So when I'm looking at this, I need my totals both to equal 100% as I go across the frequency table. And what that does is that's showing me the out of. It should be 13 out of 13 and 17 out of 17. So as I continue to look across with my frequency table, I'm going to use the individual frequencies in comparison to the total number of students. So for example, in this first box, we are going to be comparing 12 out of the 17. In the second box, we're going to be comparing 5 out of the 17 students. So of the category curfew, there are 12 out of 17 that have chores, and there are 5 out of 17 that do not have chores. Now I could either do long division or I could use my calculator, and I see that 12 divided by 17 is about 71%. So 71% of the students have a curfew and chores, and then I will do the same. 5 divided by 17 is about 29%. Now notice that 71% plus 29% gives us 100%. So we have the relative frequency as we look at curfews. We're going to do the same process as we make a relative frequency table for our no curfew. So remember, in this case, there's 13 students that do not have a curfew. So 3 of the 13 experience chores, and 10 of the 13 do not have chores or a curfew. Again, we're going to use our calculator to help us find that percentage. So I'm seeing that it's about 23%, which tells me that about 77% have no chores and no curfew. So this type of data helps us to then draw some inferences and think about associations. So in this example, it says, is there an association between curfews and students having chores? So let's look at our relative frequency table. And if we're looking at curfews, what would we say? Are students more likely to have chores or no chores? You got it. 71% of the students who have a curfew also have chores. So we would say that there is an association between curfews and chores. So we really have to look at the percentages as we think about that. If we saw a really low frequency, then we would say there probably isn't an association. But in this case, there is. And that is how we create relative frequency tables.